We want to increase their economic growth. We want to supplement it with the development of institutions. I mean, having social institutions which work transnationally, for example, the way the Ford Foundation works in China. We also want to have the development of the rule of law, finding ways in which we encourage them to develop legal structures and things that protect rights. These are the ways in which you really would have a serious strategy to advance human rights, and I think that's got to be a serious part of American foreign policy. That's quite different from the instant protest or the threat to cut off trade unless this or that person is released immediately, which actually sometimes is a useful device, but sometimes can be counterproductive.
The other... Help us understand what a theorist of international relations does. What is the nature of the subject matter, and how does that constrain the things that you can do?
I think it's first important to recognize that you can't understand the world without some theory of it, even though it may be implicit, because it's so complicated, there's so much happening, that you have to order these events somehow. So even if you think you're not a theorist, you have some implicit theory. Maybe it's a crude theory of power politics, or maybe it's a moralistic theory. But there's some theory behind people's interpretation of the world. So the first thing we try to do is to make that explicit, because if it's implicit, it may be inconsistent or maybe just simply not plausible once it's explicated in the light of day. So then, if one makes it explicit, then one sees that there are certain things that are puzzling. That is, certain things don't fit. The world keeps changing. And the interesting things for theorists are where there is some disjunction between what our theories tell us ought to be the case, what we ought to be seeing, and what we actually are seeing. And that kind of disjunction is what one tries to rectify. So how can we change the theory or elaborate a new theory in a way that would help us to understand this anomaly, this puzzle?
And it's a hard subject matter in the sense that it's hard to do scientific prediction, isn't it? I mean, it's not as easy as dealing with rocks or atoms, right?
I'm not sure dealing with rocks and atoms is easy, but yeah. Having not done it, but it's certainly, I don't believe we can do prediction very well, and I think we can't do prediction very well because the theory becomes part of the background knowledge of the actor, and so in strategic interaction, if you are if I know what your strategy is, I can devise a strategy which will beat it. But then if you know what my strategy is, you can change your strategy. Mm-hmm. So there's the old kids game of rock, scissors, paper, I often analogy. There's no solution to that game. Mm-hmm. There's no best strategy, because if you know I'm going to play rock, scissors, alternate, you can beat me every time. Mm-hmm. So I have to change my strategy. Then you have to change your strategy. So I don't think we can seek prediction in this realm when we're talking about a relatively small number of actors, normally states or multinational firms or NGOs, acting strategically with one another in a situation where they're competitive. So I don't aspire to prediction. I think you have to look for the understanding of the underlying dynamics and structures that are shaping and constraining the actors. When I was in my 30s, the dominant view of international relations was called realism. Mm-hmm. And that is the view that basically state power and state interests determine the constraints under which world politics operates. International institutions are not very important. And it's a realm of anarchy and conflict. So essentially, this view is very good at explaining the fact that we have lots of conflict in world politics, and that the conflict takes place over interests, that states which are more powerful get their way over those that are less powerful. And so there's a lot of behavior it explains. But in the 1970s, when I was looking at this, there was also, as there is now, lots of institutionalized cooperation. And in fact, the European Union was much stronger than anybody had thought it would be. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade were all quite extensively institutionalized and cooperative. And if the theory had been right, these wouldn't have existed, and they wouldn't have lasted. So that was the puzzle, that was the anomaly. Mm-hmm. And then one has to figure out, well, how, given the constraints of what we know about world politics, could these arrangements last? Well, it can't be it can't be the case that these international organizations are set up above states, that there's some running things, because we know the states are more powerful. So somehow the states had a motivation to establish international institutions that would constrain themselves with rules. Well, why would they do that? And that was the kind of puzzle I approached. And the general answer to the puzzle is you accept constraints on yourself, because in certain domains like trade, it's more important to have others constrained, to have their tariffs limited. So you agree to bind your tariffs, so they will agree to bind their tariffs. That makes uncertainty less, allows for investment, allows for trade, and therefore produces a joint gain. So it's not the case that you always have cooperation, but where you have the potential for joint gain, you have an incentive to construct institutions that will allow you to capture that potential for joint gain. So that's kind of example of the sort of puzzle-solving mentality that a theorist has. You have to be interested in puzzles for their own sake, because you are trying to resolve an anomaly or a puzzle. You don't know what the practical result of that will be, even though this was motivated by the practical concern of increasing cooperation. So there may be a motivation, in my case there was, to eventually improve the way people behave in world politics by making them more cooperative, because they could see how they could cooperate when they might previously have thought they had to conflict with each other and had to mention political economy. In fact, the work I was talking to you about a minute ago about cooperation comes from the 1980s, although I started working on it in the late 70s. But the earlier trend with Joe Nye was to contravene the notion that world politics is only about security affairs, and that political economy is not an important part of it. When we started this work in 1970, people were ignoring multinational enterprises. They were looking only at the state system. They considered the economic relations among the advanced countries to be low politics, not very interesting. What was interesting was the U.S.-Soviet conflict, nuclear weapons, international crises. And our view was that was also interesting, but there was a whole phenomenon which was certainly increasingly important, of political economy, of the use of politics to shape the economy, of the use of economic wealth to shape politics, which was not being studied. So that was another dimension of this. My cognizant dean, the dean who was the dean for our department, a man named Jim Ross, an economist, who gave me his syllabus on international organization, which in the pre-internet days was handy, a packet like this of Xerox materials. And I remember reading Paul Samuelson's article on monopolistic competition and thinking, wow, this is like international politics. So a lot of that, of the insight then came out of really analogies with work by economists. And the most important piece of work was by an economist at Berkeley named George Akerlof, who much later won the Nobel Prize for this article, probably called The Market for Lemons. Because Akerlof showed how in an economic market, the used car market, there could be market failure. That is, the lack of institutions could create a situation where prices didn't clear. A buyer was not able to buy a car from a seller for a mutually agreed price, which would have been good for them both. Because there were no institutions, there was no ability to make credible promises unless you had this institution of the used car dealer. And I saw immediately that the used car dealer was very much like the international institution, who would increase the credibility of promises, reduce uncertainty, reduce the cost of transactions, and therefore this was the key to thinking about what was the role of international institutions. They were like the used car dealer, ironically enough, because they really made it possible for these otherwise separate and distrustful entities, the buyer and the seller, or the two countries, to actually make a deal which they would both benefit from, even though they were in some sense in a partially adversarial situation.
What specific subject areas did you look at, and then what conclusions did you reach? What made cooperation work? The very same kind of factors that were described in these theories? Well,
I was looking at post-war patterns of cooperation in political economy between the United States and Western Europe, especially also Japan later. So I was looking at trade, at oil, at monetary relationships, at the political economy of the period from 1945 until 1980 or so. That was the domain.